Sup? I know what you're thinking already. Holly, where in the hell are you? A lot of stuff has been going on recently. I'm currently in a bathroom of an Airbnb in North Carolina. Like I said, a lot of stuff has been going on recently with tour, and basically our last school that we have to travel to is in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I traveled back about a week early to see my family and to see my boyfriend, and I had a great time with them. I spent some really good quality time with everybody, but that is why I've been procrastinating filming and editing this video. So happy Halloween, and if I procrastinated on this video, then Merry Christmas. Kidding. But if you don't know who I am, my name is Holly. I do YouTube very casually. If you do want to see the few videos that I do make, be sure to like and subscribe. So anyway, I just traveled to North Carolina today and I got in. That's why I have no makeup on. My hair is really flat, whatever. And I came into the bathroom and I realized that this room has this really cool light. As you can probably see back there, it's kind of like a ring light, but it's square, and then there's a blue ring light around it, if that makes sense. But I thought it would be really cool for this video because we're doing a Shane Dawson type-esque video. It is not a conspiracy theory video, but we did go to Alcatraz Island a few weeks ago and I was really pumped for it. We went as a team and I actually got to bring my camera and film some of it, and I thought, how am I going to make this into a video without it being obnoxious, me talking in this prison with all of these tourists walking around? And I was like, oh my god, I can like talk about it after I went, and then I can just film what I saw and incorporate it into the video. Basically, we went to Alcatraz. That's where I got this shirt. Pretty cool. I had a great time. So you were given a pair of headphones upon entry, and basically it was a 45-minute long audio tour, but the guy the whole time was telling you what parts of the prison to go to in order for him to tell his stories. And I'm gonna be honest, I left the prison feeling like there was so much more that I wanted to learn. So I went home, and then over the next week or so, I did my own research on Alcatraz. I learned the specific names of the prisoners who were a part of the Battle of Alcatraz, all of that cool stuff. And I found some really interesting information that I wanted to share with you guys. People know what Alcatraz Island is, right? Like, they hear about Al Capone, and then they hear about why the prison was closed and why tourists are allowed to go there now. And they know that some people died there, but they don't know how. Some people don't know the Battle of Alcatraz, what those prisoners did. They don't know how severe everything was. And I feel like since I got to see it firsthand, I wanted to bring a piece of that to you. So that's what I'm doing today. There's a lot of information to go through, so I'm just gonna start from the beginning. Basically, when you go to, I think it's Pier 37, Pier 39, you go there, you have your tickets ready, and then you actually go on a ferry. And we did the night tour. We were loading onto the ferry as sunset was starting. So it was a gorgeous view. They took us around the island, and you can actually see the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance, this direction, if you're facing the front of the boat. And then in this direction, you could see Alcatraz Island and then the skyline. And it was super beautiful. I will never forget it. And then they actually took you on the island, and that's when the fun started. We were greeted by what I thought was gonna be our tour guide, but she ended up telling us that when we actually entered the prison, we were gonna be given a headset, and then we were free to roam around and do whatever we want. So I just wanna get into some information about Alcatraz, and I have all of my research here. I wasn't fooling around with this one. Alcatraz was originally opened in 1934 to 1963 when it closed down. The prison was reopened 10 years later to the public. It is now considered one of our national parks. Just to start this off, there was about 300 civilians living on this island. Can you imagine, like, living on the same island as kidnappers, murderers, robbers. Like, there were children living on this island. These 300 people were among the families of the guard staff, the policemen. They even had their own grocery store. They had their own rec center. And I'm pretty sure that the children also had a classroom where they went to school. That to me is just so much to fathom, especially when I tell you of these escapes that happened. Anyway, the first thing that I saw walking into this prison was this quote on the wall. I'm just gonna put it up for you to see. Yeah, that's crazy. Like, I have goosebumps right now. I just can't imagine all of the horrible things these people did to get into Alcatraz. And I felt immediately walking in, there obviously was a presence of people there because I was on a tour with probably like 100 other people, but the whole feel of the place, like, I'm not kidding, I have goosebumps right now just thinking about it. It was grimy, it was, I can't even explain to you what it felt like walking in there. And the first room that we walked into was the shower room. Now, the showers, you had no privacy. The shower heads, it was like a pipe running through the middle of the room, and there were shower heads spouting on the sides of it. And I just thought, like, can you imagine, like, I know locker rooms force you to shower by yourselves, but like, even then, you're playing a sport or you're going to your school gym and you know you're washing off after. But anyway, these were grown men going to the shower all at the same time, and you were so exposed. And like, you've heard of the stuff that happens in prisons. If somebody can get their hand on a weapon and you say something wrong to them, you're done. Along with the shower room, there was a gated off area where they displayed old shoes, old uniforms, towels that they used, bed sheets, a bunch of random stuff that the prisoners used while being there. And then we went up to where the cells were. Now, the first thing that you're told in the tour, prisoners had 4 rights: food, shelter, clothes, and medical care, strangely enough. And when you go up into the cell area, you see that there's 3 floors of cells, and each cell only had a bed, a toilet, a sink, 2 shelves if you were lucky, and each cell was 5 feet by 9 feet. It was not very big, and you were in there most of the day. The first place that the tour told us about was not actually the cells, it was the recreation yard. Now, I talked about earlier how the families of the guards that lived on the island and the children, they had their own separate recreation yard. At least I hope they did. They didn't specify, but they did say that they had a recreation yard. I would hope it's not the same one the prisoners use, but basically this recreation yard, it was right outside the back of the prison. So during the tour, they did tell us that most prisoners would run laps, some of them would play baseball, and then some of them just sat on the bleachers and looked out at the skyline and thought about all the things that they were missing in San Francisco. And I have goosebumps again. Ugh, that is so weird to think about. Some of them were probably planning their escape. Some of them were probably thinking of loved ones that were left behind. Some of them were probably thinking of all the people they could hurt in order to get what they wanted. That was such a weird concept for me to grasp. And they were only allowed in this recreation yard on weekends, so they were only allowed outside on Saturday and Sundays for 5 hours a day. They were also allowed out in the recreation yard on holidays. The next place they took us into was the D block section of the cells, and this is where the solitary confinement cells were held. We actually got to go in these cells, and they are beyond scary. Basically, how they were laid out is it's a solid block of concrete 3 ways around, and then you have a regular gate, and then on top of that there's an extra wall, and it has a solid concrete door. There's actually a prisoner who was there for 19 days straight. So I did my own research on this, and basically there is a prisoner named Jim Quillen, and he has a book called My Time on the Rock, and in a section of this book he talks about his 19 days that he spent in solitary confinement. And to be honest, it is never something I would ever want to experience in my life. He talks about how soundproof the walls are. He talks about how the only times the door was ever opened for him was for meals. He couldn't tell what time of day it was. He had the same things that everyone else had in their cell. However, when morning came around and he was given his breakfast, he was asked to take the sheets off the bed and give them to the officer that opened his cell for him that morning. Basically to prevent him from sleeping the whole day, which if you think about it is kind of like just giving away your last bit of dignity is not the word that I'm looking for, but imagine being stuck in your room all day with no windows. You were slid your meals under the door and your only option was to sit either on your sheetless bed or in a corner and just contemplate life day and night until you were set free. The next thing that they talked about was the Battle of Alcatraz. I didn't realize how significant it was to the prison's timeline until I researched it for myself. It was a 45-minute tour. They couldn't fit in all of the minuscule details, but I was so curious as to why and how these men began to try to escape. The Battle of Alcatraz started on May 2nd, 1946, and this was all planned by a prisoner named Bernard Coy. I tried to do some digging on Bernard Coy, and the only thing that they said that he went to prison for originally was for a bank robbery. I feel like he would have had to do a lot more, but also it was the 30s. He was sentenced to 26 years in prison, and he actually was transferred from an Atlanta federal prison to Alcatraz for bad behavior. But anyway, this guy wanted out. He wanted nothing to do with this prison anymore, and I'm pretty sure he had some motives behind it as far as wanting to see a loved one. I'm just gonna look down at my notes so I don't pronounce these names wrong, but he had help by Marvin Hubbard, Joseph Kretzer, and Clarence Carnes, and they were all the major players in this Battle of Alcatraz as well. There was also help by Mirren Thompson and Sam Schlocke. And basically, I didn't find anything on Marvin Hubbard. I don't know what he went to prison for, but I know that Joseph Kretzer was a gang member before going into prison, and he was sentenced to 25 years for murder. And also, Clarence Carnes was a murderer at the age of 16 years old. 16! And he was sentenced to 99 years in prison, basically for life. This is a very long battle, so bear with me. So basically, Coy is very famous for this contraption that he made that basically they refer to as a bar spreader. Basically, this bar spreader was made out of a nut, a bolt, and a metal sleeve. Honestly, with all of the security that they did have at the time, it probably was very hard to get these materials and to actually make it work. But anyway, that's an important part of the story, because what they were using the bar spreader for was to actually get in the gun gallery, which was upstairs from where their cells were. The gun gallery was only protected by metal bars. They knew when the gun gallery was going to be unarmed. They knew what times of day the officers were going to be taking breaks and when they could take advantage of this gun gallery. Basically, Coy and Hubbard were out of their cells at the same time. Hubbard was in charge of cleaning the kitchen, and Coy was sweeping the floor in the dining room. Hubbard was finished cleaning the kitchen, called the officer who was on duty at the time. His last name was Miller, from what I looked up. He asked him to check the cleanliness of the kitchen, and also what they had to do was pat the prisoners down to make sure that they didn't steal any knives, spoons, anything that they could use as a weapon. While the officer was patting Hubbard down, Coy attacked Miller from behind and knocked him unconscious. Coy took the keys off of his belt and he released Kretzer and Carnes. So, do you remember the bar spreader I was telling you about? The bar spreader wasn't going to do a whole lot. It was just going to give him some wiggle room to get through the bars to the gun gallery. Just to make sure that he could fit through these bars, even with the bar spreader that he already made, he starved himself enough that he could fit through these bars without hesitation. Ugh, I have chills again, oh my god. I just can't imagine somebody wanting to get out of a place so bad to the point where they starve themselves in order to fit through bars. Like, that's some next level serial killer-ish. And the things that Coy did grab from this gun gallery, I'm gonna refer to my notes again. He grabbed a Springfield rifle that he kept for himself. He chucked down an M1 911 pistol, some keys to other places in the prison, multiple clubs, and even gas grenades. Anyway, so basically after Coy got all of these weapons down from the gun gallery and gave them to his allies, he rushed over to D Block, and there was an officer named Officer Carwin there. And he basically threatened Carwin that if he didn't release some other prisoners that he wanted to be involved in this heist, if you will, then he was going to hurt him. Carwin obviously declined and tried to fight him, and Coy ended up locking him and Officer Miller up in one of the cells in C Block. Meanwhile, his allies were trying to use the keys that they found off of Officer Miller on the door to the recreation yard that I told you guys about earlier in the back of the prison, but they didn't know that until after this whole battle was over, that they did eventually find the right key. But because they were trying to use other keys to open the door first, and they were frantically trying to get out, when they actually got to the correct key, the door jamb was so damaged that the correct key didn't even work to open the door. They were frantically running around trying to figure out what to do, and eventually I think Coy and another one of the prisoners actually ended up locking 9 officers up in these cells. I think they locked them all up between 2 cells. So as a frantic backup plan, Coy actually starts shooting out of the little window of the recreation yard door to the watchtowers to see if he could kill any of the officers. But at that point, the officials knew what was going on, and the alarm in the whole prison sounded. The other part of the plan, Kretzer decided that he was just going to open fire on these officers in these cells, and he wounded 5 of them, and eventually 1 bled out and died. I completely forgot about Shockley and Thompson. Those were the 2 prisoners that eventually helped Coy out with getting the weapons out of the gun gallery. Thompson and Shockley and Carnes actually got so scared to the point where they eventually locked themselves back in their own cells. They felt like at this point they were gonna get caught, so they were like, okay, how can I get myself out of this situation so I don't get penalized for this? Anyway, they locked themselves back in their cells, and then Coy, Hubbard, and Kretzer still stayed out of their cells. They weren't giving in. After Kretzer opened fire on these officers that were in these cells, one of them actually started taking notes of who was involved. It didn't say where he was taking notes. I didn't know if it was on a piece of paper that he had or if it was like on the rock on the wall. All it said was that he was doing it very secretively so nobody would know what he was doing. So anyway, the last 3 prisoners all cornered in this back alleyway, and by that time they called the Marines in, which is just so random to me when I was reading this. They drilled holes in the ceiling and then dropped grenades where they thought that these prisoners were cornered. So where these prisoners were actually hiding was the C Block utility corridor. This won't be the last time that this corridor was used. So they eventually knew that these prisoners were in the utility corridor, and the warden tried to make a deal with them that if they would surrender, nothing else would happen to them. They would just go about their day and not be punished, which obviously I don't believe. I don't think they believed it either. The officers and Marines waiting outside the corridor heard a gunshot coming from their direction, and they opened fire on them. You could probably guess what happened next. The Marines and officers later found them dead. I don't even think that's like the craziest end to this story. Basically, before the Battle of Alcatraz, Hubbard had a federal hearing scheduled for the Monday after he died. Basically, his petition said the confession he made for the crimes that he committed was beaten out of him. The craziest part of this whole petition of his was that he had medical documents proving that he was beaten severely right before he was supposed to have his trial and confess for what he did. There's even a quote from his prosecutor. Joseph Karish was his name. He even said that Hubbard had a good chance of actually being released from Alcatraz because he had enough evidence to say that the police beat his confession out of him. And like I said, that federal hearing was supposed to be the Monday after he died. He was so close to getting out of this prison, and he went out in a blaze of glory and was shot to death. That's so crazy for my head to wrap around. And it gets worse, I guess. You remember Thompson and Shockley, the two guys that kind of like joined in last minute but then backed out last minute because they didn't want to get in trouble? And do you remember that guy writing names down of everybody that was involved in this Battle of Alcatraz? They were eventually confronted about the Battle of Alcatraz, and almost exactly 7 months after the Battle of Alcatraz happened, they were killed by gas chambers in the San Francisco Federal Prison. And do you remember Carnes, the 16-year-old murderer who was sentenced basically to life in prison? All he was given was an additional life sentence, which ultimately does nothing. But when the prison closed, he was transferred to another prison, was released in 1973 for good behavior, went back out into the real world, went back into prison again, and actually died of AIDS in 1988. I don't know if he was still a minor at the time, and that's why they didn't kill him, but it seemed kind of harsh giving the two people who joined in last minute the same ending as the 3 others who started it. And then the 4th one, who started it as well, who was in from the beginning, was just given another life sentence. But like, I guess that's how our government worked back in the 40s. I don't know. Just to give you guys an idea of how many people were in this prison at one time, a total of 1,545 men stayed in this prison from the time it was open to the time it closed. And the most prisoners that they had at one point in time in Alcatraz was 302, and the least amount of prisoners that they've ever had at one time was 222. And the average stay of a prisoner in Alcatraz was only 8 years. These prisoners were also only allowed 1 visit per month by a loved one or a friend, and it had to be approved by the warden. These people would take a ferry out to Alcatraz, and they would come in the front door, they had to check in, and then they were escorted into a room, and the only thing separating them and the prisoners was a 2-inch thick glass window. There was never a time where these visits were not supervised. I wanted to talk about one more escape attempt from Alcatraz that's pretty interesting. This was in June of 1962, and this was the year before Alcatraz closed for good, which is really interesting. This escape attempt was executed by Frank Morris and 2 brothers. Their names were John and Clarence Anglin. Each room had a little air vent right above the floor of their cells. These guys would get stones, they would get spoons, literally anything they could get their hands on, and sneak back into their cell. They would just sit and pick at the vent for hours and hours and hours, and they would try to not be seen, obviously, because that's suspicious. One of them even stole a vacuum cleaner motor and made a drill out of it. Anything loud that happened, they would use that drill, and that would save them a lot of time picking at this wall. Eventually, they dug around enough that they could get the vents out, but they couldn't stop there. Just like Bernard Coy did, they had to starve themselves in order to fit in these vents. And these vents led to the C Block utility corridor, like I talked about earlier in the Battle of Alcatraz. But before they could escape to the roof, they had to make dummy heads. They made them out of soap, concrete powder, and hair that they stole from the prisoner barbershop. When they escaped to the roof, they actually, ahead of time, had stolen over 50 raincoats from the prison, and they made a life raft out of it for all of them to swim across to San Francisco. Because I don't know if you guys have been in the San Francisco Bay or even felt the San Francisco Bay, but it's freezing pretty much all year around. If the life raft didn't work, they were basically going to freeze and then drown to death. And that's basically all they know about what happened to these men. There was an ongoing investigation. Basically, they just said that they drowned in the bay, like the life vest raft didn't work, but then they did some more digging, and somebody actually found a raft made out of some rubber material on Angel Island, which is actually 2.5 miles from Alcatraz, and it's in the complete different direction of San Francisco, which I guess if you're going to escape, it's better to escape where they don't think you're going to rather than where they think you're going to. But nobody really knows because the investigation was closed basically after the prison was closed. So no one really knows if those guys are still wandering around or if their kids are wandering around. People always ask, well, Holly, ultimately, how many people died on Alcatraz? Or how many people died in the bay escaping from Alcatraz? Nobody really knows. The sources I found say that 8 people were murdered by inmates on Alcatraz, 5 committed suicide, and 15 died from illnesses. There was a story I read somewhere that one of the guys that committed suicide actually was in solitary confinement. Somehow he found something sharp to cut his arteries this way, and he covered himself in his covers and just bled to death. Oh, it's so weird to think about. But anyway, I loved my experience on Alcatraz. I was only there for a few hours, but I felt like I was somewhere that was very significant to our history and the way we were as Americans back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. There was a point in time where I was sitting in the cafeteria and I just sat there and I closed my eyes and I envisioned all of the tables and chairs and prisoners mingling and eating and walking around the prison and what that was like. If you're ever in San Francisco and you have an extra night to do something fun, please, 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 please check out this prison. It is unlike anything you have ever seen in your life. And if I ever was back in San Francisco, I 100% would go again. Obviously, this is very different from any other video that I've made, so let me know if you enjoyed it. I know I enjoyed making it. It was very, very cool to actually do research on this. So anyway, let me know if you guys liked this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did. Be sure to hit that subscribe button and be sure to comment below if you want to see anything else from me, anything new. Happy Halloween, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Bye.